I am Zuri. I am 36 years old, and I run one of the top crisis management and public relations firms in Atlanta. Last weekend at our annual family barbecue, I accidentally bumped into my husband's 20-year-old daughter, Jada. She immediately screamed at the top of her lungs, telling me to never touch her again. The entire backyard went completely silent. My husband Trey did not even ask what happened. He just looked at me with pure ice in his eyes and said to apologize to her right now or get out. So I took off my apron, set it on the table, and walked away. What they did not know was that by the time they finished their little party and drove back to what they thought was their luxury home, a massive shock would be waiting for them on the front lawn. Before I get into the details of exactly how I dismantled their entitlement, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit that like button and subscribe if you have ever had to remind a toxic family member exactly who holds the power. To understand how we reached that breaking point, you have to understand the dynamic of my so-called family. It was the 4th of July, and the Georgia heat was already suffocating by noon. My mother-in-law Vivian hosts a massive cookout every single year at her sprawling brick estate in Buckhead. Vivian is the self-appointed matriarch of the family, a woman who values social status, church appearances, and family image above absolutely everything else. She is also a woman who has never hidden her disdain for me. Despite the fact that I built a multi-million-dollar company from the ground up, Vivian always viewed me as a threat to her son's masculinity. Trey is 42 years old, a regional director for a logistics company who constantly needs to project the image of an alpha male provider. The reality of our financial situation is vastly different, but I spent years playing the supportive wife, keeping my success quietly in the background so his fragile ego could thrive in the spotlight. That afternoon, I was doing exactly what was expected of a good daughter-in-law. While the rest of the family mingled on the wrap-around porch sipping sweet tea and signature cocktails, I was stuck in the humid kitchen carrying heavy aluminum trays of ribs, baked beans, and potato salad out to the buffet tables. I did not mind the work itself. I grew up working hard, and I know how to contribute to a family gathering. What I minded was the blatant disrespect that hung in the air every time I stepped outside. The family treated me less like a successful entrepreneur and more like the hired help. And the absolute worst offender was Jada. Jada is Trey's daughter from a previous relationship. She is 20 years old, currently attending Spelman College, and has been spoiled beyond comprehension her entire life. Trey overcompensates for his past mistakes by giving her a credit card with no limit, while Vivian treats her like royalty. From the moment Trey and I started dating, Jada made it her personal mission to ensure I knew my place. She viewed me as an interloper, a gold digger trying to steal her father's wealth, which is highly ironic considering I make triple his salary. She never calls me by my name unless she absolutely has to, usually referring to me as her dad's new wife, even though we have been married for 5 years. As I arranged the food on the patio tables, I could hear Vivian holding court near the pool. She was surrounded by her church friends and extended family, talking loudly enough to make sure I heard every word. She was going on and on about how brilliant Jada was doing at Spelman, boasting about her grades and her sorority activities. Then she smoothly transitioned into a thinly veiled insult directed at me. She told her friends that it takes a real woman with a maternal instinct to raise a child. Right, implying that career-obsessed women simply lack the warmth necessary for family life. I just kept arranging the serving spoons, keeping my face perfectly neutral. In my line of work, you learn never to let them see you sweat. You learn to read the room, collect the data, and wait for the precise moment to strike. Jada was lounging on a chaise chair nearby, tapping away on the latest smartphone that I had actually paid for. She was wearing a designer sundress and a pair of sunglasses that cost more than my first car. When I walked past her to adjust the umbrella shading the desserts, she deliberately scoffed and rolled her eyes. I asked her politely if she could move her designer tote bag off the food table so I could set down the fresh tray of cornbread. Instead of simply moving it, she looked at me over the rim of her sunglasses and said that the bag was worth more than my catering services, so I should just find somewhere else to put the food. The disrespect was palpable. Several of my husband's cousins heard her and simply looked away, pretending not to notice the blatant insult. I looked over at Trey, hoping my husband would finally step in and correct his daughter's behavior. Instead, he was laughing loudly with his brother Malik holding a beer and completely ignoring the toxic dynamic unfolding right in front of him. Trey always took the path of least resistance when it came to his family. He expected me to be the bigger person to swallow my pride and just accept the disrespect because Jada grew up without a stable mother figure. For years, I had done exactly that. I had compromised my own peace to maintain the illusion of his perfect family. I paid the bills, I funded the lifestyle, and I absorbed the insults while they paraded around playing the role of high society elites. The tension in the backyard was thick enough to cut with a knife. Every time I walked past Jada, she would mutter something under her breath to her cousins, snickering and pointing in my direction. Vivian would look over and smile an encouraging look that validated Jada's horrible attitude. They had created an echo chamber of entitlement, feeding off each other's negativity. I was the outsider, the hardworking woman who did not fit into their pretentious narrative. They thought because I stayed quiet, I was weak. They thought because I served the food, I was subordinate. They completely, fundamentally misunderstood the nature of my silence. As a crisis manager, I do not react to petty provocations. I observe the weaknesses in my opponents, and I prepare for total dismantling. I continued to weave through the crowded backyard, carrying fresh towels for the pool guests and collecting empty cups. The summer air smelled of charcoal smoke and expensive perfume, a strange mix that perfectly captured the essence of my in-laws. I could feel the hostile energy radiating from the corner where Jada sat holding her court of admiring relatives. She was deliberately loud, making sure her laughter pierced through the background music every time I came near. It was a calculated performance designed to show everyone that she held the social power in this family, while I was merely a temporary fixture, tolerated only because I happened to be married to her father. The afternoon dragged on, the heat rising, along with the unspoken hostility, preparing the perfect stage for the collision that was about to happen. Before I could even formulate a response to Trey, an unwanted hand landed softly on my bare shoulder. I turned my head to see Harper, my brother-in-law Malik's wife, stepping into the center of the patio to insert herself squarely into my business. Harper is a wealthy white woman from Connecticut who married into this family 5 years ago and immediately appointed herself the resident expert on our cultural dynamics. She runs a boutique nonprofit organization that she constantly posts about on social media, and she loves using therapy speak to mediate situations that have absolutely nothing to do with her. She wore a breezy linen dress and a deeply concerned expression that looked like she had practiced it in the mirror all morning. "Zuri, let us just take a collective breath," she said, lowering her voice to that soothing, condescending tone you would use on a toddler throwing a tantrum in a grocery store. "We are all family here. I know you are feeling defensive right now, but we really need to look at the bigger picture and practice some radical empathy." I stared at her hand on my shoulder. I looked directly into her eyes and held her gaze until she blinked and slowly pulled her hand back, clearly unsettled by my silence. I did not say a single word. I just waited for her to dig her own grave. "You see," Zuri Harper continued, gesturing vaguely toward Jada, who was still clinging to Vivian. "You have to understand the deep-seated trauma that comes with being a young Black woman, growing up without her biological mother, consistently in the home. There are profound abandonment issues there. There is a generational pain and a systemic anxiety that you simply cannot dismiss just because you feel your personal pride has been injured today." Jada is acting out from a place of deep hurt and emotional scarcity. As the adult in the room and as an educated woman of color, you need to decenter your own ego. You need to show her what grace and healing actually look like. Getting down and cleaning that bag isn't about submission, Zuri. It is about breaking toxic cycles. It is about doing the work to heal a fractured family dynamic. The sheer audacity of her monologue nearly knocked the breath out of my lungs. Here was a highly privileged white woman standing in a Buckhead backyard, lecturing me, a self-made Black woman who fought her way out of poverty through sheer grit, about generational trauma and decentering my ego. She was entirely weaponizing social justice buzzwords and pseudo-psychology to justify a spoiled 20-year-old throwing a vicious tantrum over a spilled drink. It was a masterclass in performative allyship masking absolute disrespect. I glanced around the patio to gauge the audience. Malik was nodding along with his wife's speech, looking incredibly profound, as if she had just quoted scripture. Vivian had a triumphant smirk playing on her lips, clearly thrilled that even her white daughter-in-law was putting me in my proper place. And Trey, my husband, stood taller, his chest puffed out, fully validating this ridiculous display. He looked at me with an expectant glare, waiting for Harper's lecture to break my spirit and force me to my knees. He honestly believed this united front would finally break my independence. In my line of work, crisis management relies on identifying the exact moment a situation is no longer salvageable. You do not waste resources trying to repair a burning building when the foundation has already turned to ash. You secure the perimeter, you protect your vital assets, and you walk away to build somewhere else. Looking at Trey's smug, entitled face, I realized my marriage was not just burning. It had been ashes for years. I had simply been paying for the smoke and mirrors. I had subsidized his alpha male fantasy while shrinking myself to fit into his deeply insecure life. I did not shed a single tear. My heart rate did not even spike. I did not give them the angry, bitter reaction they were all so desperately waiting for me to fulfill. Instead, I reached behind my back and found the knot of my expensive catering apron. I pulled the strings loose. The heavy fabric slipped off my shoulders. I folded it deliberately, smoothing out the creases with steady, slow hands, and placed it gently on the cedar table next to the remaining trays of food. The silence in the backyard was absolute. The entire party watched my hands, waiting for my compliance or my explosion. I gave them neither. I maintained a chilling, absolute stillness. I looked at Harper first. "Thank you for that fascinating sociological breakdown, Harper," I said, my voice smooth and chillingly calm. "You should save that exact speech for your next charity gala. I am sure your wealthy donors will eat it up." Harper's face flushed a deep, angry crimson. She opened her mouth to argue, but I had already turned my back on her, completely dismissing her existence. My eyes locked onto my husband. Trey was no longer looking triumphant. A tiny flicker of confusion crossed his features as he realized I was not moving toward the puddle of pink lemonade on the stone patio. I was stepping away from it. "All right, Trey," I said, projecting my voice just enough so that every single guest in that backyard could hear my final verdict loud and clear. "You want to be the undisputed alpha. You want to demand submission to protect your fragile ego in front of your mother. I will not stop you. You have exactly one evening left to enjoy being the master of this house." His brow furrowed. "What are you talking about?" he demanded, his authoritative tone wavering slightly. "Do not walk away from me when I am talking to you, Zuri," I said. "Clean up the mess right now." I did not bother to respond to his command. I simply picked up my phone and my car keys from the nearby table. The crowd parted like the Red Sea as I walked through the patio, heading straight for the side gate. I did not look at Vivian. I did not look at Jada, who had suddenly stopped her fake crying and was staring at me with genuine confusion. I kept my head held high, my shoulders pulled back, and my posture flawless. My heels clicked rhythmically against the stone pathway, a steady marching beat of finality. "Zuri!" Trey yelled from the patio, his voice cracking with genuine panic now. The reality that I was not backing down was finally sinking into his thick skull. "If you walk out that gate, do not bother coming back." I pushed the heavy wooden gate open and stepped out onto the pristine driveway where my slate gray Porsche Panamera was parked. I pressed the button on my key fob, and the car chirped twice, unlocking with a satisfying mechanical click. I opened the driver's side door, sliding into the cool leather seat. Through the windshield, I could see Trey standing near the edge of the house, flanked by Malik and Harper. They were staring at me, expecting me to hesitate. They thought this was a temporary bluff. They thought I would sit in my car, cry for a few minutes, and then come back inside to make peace and beg for my marriage. I started the engine. The powerful roar of the Porsche echoed through the quiet suburban neighborhood, drowning out the sound of Trey calling my name one last time. I shifted into gear, pulled smoothly out of Vivian's long, sweeping driveway, and merged onto the main road without looking in the rearview mirror once. The Atlanta heat beat down on the pavement outside, but inside my car, the air conditioning was ice cold, matching the exact temperature of my heart. The time for keeping the peace and protecting Trey's ego was officially over. It was time to initiate protocol and burn his world to the ground. I merged onto the interstate highway, the twin-turbo engine of my Porsche roaring to life. I reached out and turned up the volume on the stereo. A heavy rhythmic bass line filled the cabin, matching the steady calculating pulse pounding in my temples. Every time the beat dropped, my mind snapped back to a different memory, a different red flag I had willingly painted white for the sake of love. The beat hit. I was sitting at a five-star steakhouse downtown 6 months ago. Trey was at the head of the table holding court with his fraternity brothers and their wives. He ordered 3 bottles of expensive champagne without blinking an eye. "I got this," he announced loudly, pulling a sleek metal credit card from his wallet. He basked in the applause, soaking up the praise for being such a generous provider. The memory shifted sharply to the next morning. I was sitting at my home office desk, staring at the notification on my laptop. That sleek metal card was linked directly to my company's operating account. I paid the $3,000 bill so his friends could continue believing he was the undisputed king of Atlanta. The highway lights flashed across my windshield in quick succession. I pressed my foot harder on the gas pedal. For 5 years I had been the invisible scaffolding holding up his towering ego. The music thumped again. Another memory surfaced, sharp and bitter. We were in our bedroom. I had just closed a massive crisis management contract with a tech firm. I was exhausted, but proud. Trey walked in, completely ignoring my celebration, and dropped a folder on my lap. It was a foreclosure notice for a property his mother Vivian had secretly purchased and failed to maintain. "We need to handle this, Zuri," he said, using the word "we" to mask his own failure. "A man takes care of his mother. I need you to wire the funds by Tuesday. Just consider it an advance on my bonus." His bonus never materialized. My hard-earned money vanished into Vivian's bloated real estate mistake, and Trey walked into church that Sunday, accepting praises from the congregation for being such a devoted, successful son. I gripped the leather steering wheel. My knuckles turned white. My crisis management firm specialized in mitigating disasters for politicians and celebrities. I was an expert at stopping financial hemorrhages, yet I had allowed the biggest liability to sleep in my own bed. The beat dropped harder. A memory from just 3 months ago flashed before my eyes. Trey and Jada were sitting in our living room. Jada was complaining about needing a new car to commute to her sorority events at Spelman. Trey puffed out his chest, completely dismissing the perfectly good sedan I had helped her buy a year earlier. "My daughter does not drive used cars," he declared, wrapping an arm around her shoulders. "Daddy is going to get you something brand new. Whatever you want, princess." He made the promise. He soaked up the adoration. He played the ultimate provider. 2 days later, he came to my office, closing the door behind him, with a sheepish smile that I now recognized as purely predatory. He spun a ridiculous story about his corporate logistics accounts being temporarily frozen due to a regional audit. He needed me to co-sign the loan for Jada's new Mercedes, just as a formality. He promised to take over the payments immediately. I signed the paper to keep the peace. I had been making the $1,000 monthly payments ever since. I remembered the family vacations to Cabo and Paris. Trey would stand at the resort bars handing out $100 bills as tips, acting like a titan of industry. Behind closed doors, I was the one negotiating the travel packages and transferring funds from my high-yield savings accounts to ensure his credit cards did not decline at the front desk. Every time his brother Malik asked him for business advice, Trey would speak with absolute authority, regurgitating the exact financial strategies he had overheard me discussing with my corporate clients. He wore my success like a tailored suit, claiming the fit was all his own. The car sped through the night. The illusion was completely shattered. Trey was not a regional director climbing the corporate ladder. He was a middle management employee, drowning in debt, desperately trying to maintain a facade of wealth that he could never afford. He needed me not for love, but for survival. I was his bank. I was his safety net. I was the silent partner funding his elaborate stage play. Vivian thought she was looking down on me because of my background, but the absolute truth was that my background gave me the hustle required to finance her entire family's fraudulent lifestyle. They despised me because I was a self-made woman, yet they had absolutely no problem reaching into my pockets to maintain their own illusions of grandeur. I pressed the button on my dashboard to lower the windows, letting the warm evening air rush into the cabin. The wind whipped around me, carrying away the last remnants of the dutiful wife I had been pretending to be. I had compromised my brilliance to make him comfortable. I had dimmed my own light so his fragile masculinity could cast a shadow. I had allowed Harper to lecture me on systemic issues while I was literally the system keeping her brother-in-law out of bankruptcy. I had let Vivian treat me like the help while my bank account paid for the catered food she was currently serving to her guests. The beat of the music hit its final crescendo, filling the car with a fierce driving energy. I was not crying. I was not angry. Anger is a useless emotion that clouds judgment and makes you reckless. Instead, I felt an exhilarating razor-sharp focus taking over my entire body. Trey had pushed me too far tonight. He thought making me kneel in front of his family would solidify his dominance. He thought public humiliation would force me into submission. Instead, it had shattered the final chain binding me to his pathetic masquerade. He had forced me to choose between my dignity and my marriage, completely forgetting that a woman who builds an empire from scratch never negotiates her dignity. The realization was absolute and empowering. Trey was nothing without my infrastructure. Jada's designer lifestyle was entirely dependent on my tolerance. They had mistaken my love for weakness and my financial support for an obligation. As the highway stretched out before me, leading me back to the city, I shifted my mind from personal heartbreak to professional execution. I was no longer a wife dealing with a disrespectful family. I was a crisis manager dealing with a hostile corporate takeover. He had enjoyed the benefits of my success for 5 years while actively participating in my disrespect. Now he was about to learn exactly what happens when the funding is permanently cut off. I guided the Porsche off the interstate, taking the familiar exit toward downtown Atlanta. I did not go back to our shared house. That house was a battlefield I would return to later when I was fully armed. Instead, I pulled into the private underground parking garage of my firm's corporate headquarters. The thick concrete walls offered a cool, silent sanctuary, completely insulated from the humid, chaotic energy of Vivian's backyard. I turned off the engine, but the adrenaline in my veins was still running at redline. I reached over to the passenger seat and picked up my encrypted iPad. For the past 6 months, I had not just been playing the role of an oblivious wife. I had been an auditor. It started with a seemingly innocent, misplaced receipt and a minor discrepancy in our joint operating account that Trey tried to brush off as a banking glitch. But you do not build a premier crisis management firm by ignoring red flags. You dig. And I dug deep. I bypassed his flimsy passwords and looked right through the financial smokescreens he thought were so incredibly clever. I had even hired a forensic accountant under a strict non-disclosure agreement to trace every single dime. I unlocked the screen with my fingerprint. The bright display illuminated the dark cabin of my car, casting a blue glow over the leather steering wheel. I opened a master file labeled Project T. Yes, I had officially reduced my husband of 5 years to a corporate case file. It was the only psychological mechanism I had to process the sheer volume of his deceit without completely losing my mind. My finger hovered over the screen before tapping to open a subfolder marked Joint Account Discrepancies. I pulled up the transaction history from late January. There it was, staring back at me in cold, hard black and white digits. A massive wire transfer of $50,000. I closed my eyes for a fraction of a second, remembering the exact conversation we had the night before that money vanished from our portfolio. Trey had sat on the edge of our California king bed, looking uncharacteristically solemn and deeply reflective. He had spun a beautiful, heartfelt narrative about wanting to establish a meaningful legacy. He claimed his college alumni association was setting up a specialized minority scholarship fund for underprivileged youth in the greater Atlanta area. He told me he wanted to be a founding donor. He wanted to be the man who gave back to the community and helped lift up the next generation. He looked me dead in the eyes, held my hands, and said it would cement his reputation as a true community leader. Touched by his supposed generosity and his desire to do something impactful, I authorized the transfer from our high-yield joint investment account without a second thought. I swiped left on the iPad screen, bringing up the actual destination of those cleared funds. The forensic trace was undeniable. The routing numbers did not lead to a charitable foundation. They did not go to an alumni association or a non-profit organization. They led directly to the corporate account of a luxury automotive dealership in Alpharetta. $50,000. The exact amount required for the hefty down payment and the first year of premium insurance on a pearl-white Mercedes-Benz C-Class. The sickening puzzle pieces snapped together with perfect mathematical precision. 3 weeks after that wire transfer cleared, Jada had driven that exact pearl-white Mercedes into Vivian's driveway. She had paraded around the neighborhood screaming and hugging Trey, jumping up and down in excitement. She had loudly thanked her daddy for working so incredibly hard to buy her a dream car just for making the dean's list at Spelman. I vividly remembered standing on the porch that day watching the spectacle unfold. Trey had stood there, chest puffed out, soaking up the adoration of his daughter and the glowing praises of his mother and brother. He had played the role of the ultimate provider flawlessly. He had bought his daughter's affection and purchased his family's respect using the money I generated from working 80-hour weeks managing corporate disasters. He stole from my sweat equity to fund a fake scholarship that actually just financed his spoiled daughter's luxury commute. The sheer audacity of the betrayal was staggering. It was not just the financial loss. $50,000 was a fraction of what my firm brought in during a single quarter. I could absorb the financial hit. What I could not absorb was the unadulterated disrespect. He had looked his wife in the eye, played on my philanthropic values, and weaponized my empathy to steal from me. He used the noble concept of helping underprivileged Black youth to buy a shiny toy for an entitled girl who routinely treated the woman paying for the car like absolute garbage. I stared at the banking PDF until the numbers began to blur on the screen. The irony was almost poetic. Jada had just spent the entire afternoon at the barbecue, calling me classless and acting like she was inherently superior to me. She walked around clutching a Christian Dior tote bag and driving a luxury European sedan, completely blind to the fact that her entire high society aesthetic was fully subsidized by my bank account. She hated me, but she was literally living off the crumbs of my empire. Trey thought he had covered his tracks perfectly. The forensic report showed he had funneled the money through a dummy limited liability company he set up under his brother Malik's name before it hit the dealership. He added an extra layer of routing, thinking it would wash the transaction clean. He actually thought he was smarter than a woman who handles multi-million-dollar corporate espionage and public relations scandals for a living. He thought my silence over the past few months meant I was clueless. I tapped the screen again, pulling up the ownership documents for the vehicle. Because Trey's credit score was a complete disaster, he could not secure the remaining financing for the car on his own. The dealership records showed my name listed as the primary guarantor on the loan. I was legally on the hook for a car driven by a girl who had just screamed at me to get out of her grandmother's backyard. A cold, predatory calm washed over me, pushing out any lingering traces of marital grief. When a business partner embezzles funds, you do not cry. You do not ask for couples counseling. You freeze the assets and you liquidate the partnership. Trey had breached the contract. He had operated in bad faith, and he had publicly disrespected the primary stakeholder. I closed the banking application and opened my secure messaging portal. The time for quietly gathering evidence in the shadows was over. The time for aggressive asset recovery had officially begun. I needed to lock him out of every single financial pipeline before he realized the game was up. I tapped the contact from my lead corporate attorney. The engine of my retaliation was fully fueled, and it was time to hit the ignition. The phone barely rang twice before Marcus answered. I did not bother with pleasantries or small talk. I simply told him that Project T was no longer a contingency plan, but an active protocol. I instructed him to freeze every joint account block, all secondary cardholder access, and immediately initiate the separation of assets. Marcus, who had helped me build my corporate structure from day one, did not ask any emotional questions. He only asked for the specific timeline. I told him I wanted everything locked down within the hour. After ending the call, I closed the banking application on my iPad and opened the most important file in my entire digital vault. The folder was simply labeled Real Estate Holdings. I tapped on the primary document, and a high-resolution scan of a property deed filled the screen. If the $50,000 car loan was the final insult, this document was my ultimate weapon. It was the absolute fail-safe I had engineered long before I ever walked down the aisle. For the past 5 years, Trey had played the role of the master of the manor. Our primary residence is a sprawling custom-built six-bedroom contemporary mansion situated on 2 acres of prime real estate in an exclusive gated community. It features imported Italian marble countertops, a climate-controlled wine cellar, a fully equipped home theater, and a massive outdoor kitchen where Trey loves to host his friends. He treats that house like his personal kingdom. He frequently invites his fraternity brothers over for cigar nights, giving them grand tours and boasting about the custom upgrades he supposedly negotiated. He walks through the vaulted hallways with his chest puffed out, pointing out the architectural details as if he designed them himself. Vivian is even worse. My mother-in-law regularly brings the senior ladies from her church committee over for afternoon tea, strictly for the purpose of showing off. I have stood in my own kitchen pouring coffee while listening to Vivian tell her friends that her brilliant son purchased a multi-million-dollar estate before he turned 40. I would watch Trey stand there, soaking in the praise, accepting the admiration, and never once correcting her. He never once mentioned that his name was nowhere near the actual title of the property. The truth staring back at me on the illuminated iPad screen was beautifully, ruthlessly simple. I bought that mansion entirely in cash exactly 6 months before Trey and I got married. I did not use a mortgage broker, and I certainly did not combine our finances. Because of my background in crisis management and risk assessment, I never leave my personal assets vulnerable to emotional decisions. I worked with my wealth management team to purchase the property under a blind trust managed by a holding company called Aegis Strategic Investments, LLC. I am the sole managing member and 100% equity owner of that corporation. Trey has absolutely no idea how complex property law actually works. When we were engaged and moving in together, I presented him with a stack of documents disguised as standard homeowner insurance forms and tax optimization paperwork. I used heavy corporate jargon, explaining that structuring our residence through an LLC would protect us from personal liability if my public relations firm ever got sued. His ego was so massive and his actual financial literacy so incredibly low that he nodded along vigorously. He pretended to understand exactly what I was talking about because he never wanted to look uneducated in front of me. He signed exactly where I told him to sign. What he actually signed was a legally binding residential occupancy agreement. On paper, in the eyes of the state of Georgia, Trey is not a homeowner. He does not have a single drop of marital equity in the property. Legally speaking, my husband is nothing more than a tenant at will. He pays zero rent, he holds zero ownership, and he can be asked to vacate the premises at the sole discretion of the LLC management. I zoomed in on his signature at the bottom of the PDF. The irony of the situation was intoxicating. Just an hour ago in his mother's backyard, Trey had the absolute audacity to give me an ultimatum. He told me to get down on my knees to apologize to his spoiled daughter or get out of the family. He thought he held the power of eviction. He truly believed that because he yelled the loudest, he controlled the environment. He thought he could banish me from his life and return to his luxurious mansion to celebrate his dominance. He was going to return to a house he did not own. He was going to park a car he could not afford in a driveway that belonged exclusively to the woman he had just publicly humiliated. He had spent years promising Jada that the house would be her inheritance. He had told his brother Malik that they could borrow against the home's equity to fund Malik's failing business ventures. They had built an entire dynasty of entitlement on a foundation of brick and mortar that I owned free and clear. I swiped to the next page of the legal file. It was the standard eviction notice template that Marcus and I had drafted months ago when I first noticed the banking discrepancies. It was completely filled out, perfectly legal, and ready to be executed. As a tenant at will without a fixed-term lease, Trey had absolutely no legal standing to remain on the property once the owner revoked permission. Because the home was owned by a corporate entity rather than an individual spouse, the standard marital home protections did not apply. The assets were completely shielded from any potential divorce proceedings. The cool air conditioning of the Porsche blew against my face, but I felt a profound radiating heat of vindication. They wanted to treat me like a common servant. They wanted to reduce me to the woman who carried the trays and cleaned up the messes while they lived like royalty. They were about to learn a brutal lesson about the true nature of power. Power is not screaming in a backyard. Power is not wearing designer clothes bought with stolen money. Power is holding the deed to the castle while everyone else is just playing make-believe. I minimized the legal document and opened my email application. I attached the eviction notice along with the asset freeze confirmation and the corporate ownership records. I addressed the email directly to my dedicated private security team. They were a group of highly trained former law enforcement officers who handled physical security for my high-profile corporate clients. They were discreet, ruthlessly efficient, and fiercely loyal to my firm. I typed out my instructions with rapid, precise keystrokes. The emotional wife who tried to blend into the background was officially dead. The corporate executive had taken the wheel. I was about to turn my personal life into a masterclass on crisis neutralization. I checked the digital clock on the dashboard. It was exactly 5 in the evening. I had 3 hours before the sun went down, and I intended to use every single minute of it to dismantle the fake reality Trey had built. I hit send on the email and immediately dialed the direct line to Vance, the head of my private security detail. Vance is a former federal agent who handles high-risk extractions and asset protection for my most vulnerable corporate clients. He is a man of few words and absolute precision, which is exactly why he is on my payroll. He picked up on the very first ring. Vance, I said, keeping my voice stripped of any lingering emotion. I sent over a highly sensitive dossier to your encrypted inbox. Review the legal attachments immediately. I listened to the steady, rapid tapping of his keyboard on the other end of the line. It took him exactly 15 seconds to open the file, verify the judicial signatures on the asset freeze, and process the eviction notice. Understood, he said simply. What are your specific orders? Activate Protocol 4. "04," I commanded. I want a full tactical lockdown of the primary residence effective immediately. Wipe the entire biometric database at the front gates and the main doors. Delete all fingerprint access codes for Trey and Jada. Contact the neighborhood security pavilion and blacklist Trey's license plate. As of this exact second, they are entirely locked out of the property and flagged as trespassers. Copy that, Vance replied, his tone strictly business. And regarding their personal belongings inside the residence, I want a full sweep of the master suite and the East Wing guest room, I instructed. Pack every single item belonging to Trey and Jada, the tailored suits, the custom sneakers, the designer handbags, the jewelry, and the electronics. I do not care if your team has to use heavy-duty contractor trash bags or the cardboard boxes left over in the storage unit. Just get it all out of the house. I want everything they own stacked neatly on the front lawn before 8 o'clock tonight. I paused, making sure my next words were crystal clear. And Vance, I do not mean the covered porch. I mean the grass. I want it sitting right there on the sod where the entire gated community can see it clearly when they drive past. We will have a rapid response team on site in 20 minutes, Vance confirmed. We will supervise the packing process and secure the perimeter. If he leaves the barbecue early and shows up while we are working, how do you want us to proceed? Do not let him step a single foot past the property line, I said. Hand him the eviction notice through the gate. If he gets loud or attempts to act aggressively, do not engage in a physical altercation. Let the local police handle his temper tantrum. I have already informed the precinct captain about the asset freeze and the active eviction order. They are ready to dispatch units if he causes a disturbance. I disconnected the call and took a slow, deliberate breath. The physical perimeter was secured, but I needed to establish the financial border. The eviction notice would wound his pride, but cutting off the money supply would completely paralyze him. I opened my firm's encrypted banking application on the iPad. I navigated through the secure portals until I reached the corporate accounts and the secondary cardholder access lists. Trey had a platinum corporate card he used exclusively to fund his luxurious social life. Jada had a secondary gold card linked to my primary checking account, which she treated like a bottomless ATM for her college expenses and shopping sprees. With 2 deliberate, precise swipes, I suspended both accounts. I did not just pause them temporarily. I permanently canceled the cards, removed their names from the authorized user list, and flagged the accounts to block any pending transactions. I systematically went through the digital wallets, disabling their Apple Pay access and canceling the auto draft payments I had set up for their personal cell phone bills and memberships. In my mind, I pictured Trey standing at the outdoor bar of his mother's house, offering to pay for a premium bottle of liquor to impress his brother Malik. I pictured him handing over that heavy metal card with his signature confident smirk, only for the bartender to return and tell him the card was declined. I pictured Jada sitting poolside trying to buy another overpriced accessory online to soothe her ego, only to see a bright red error message flash across her screen. The financial umbilical cord was officially and permanently severed. I was no longer the silent benefactor funding their profound disrespect. The Bank of Zuri was permanently closed. I sat back against the leather seat of my Porsche, letting the absolute silence of the underground garage wrap around me like a protective shield. For the first time in 5 long years, my chest did not feel tight with the anxiety of managing Trey's fragile ego. The heavy, suffocating burden of pretending to be less than I was, just so he could feel like a dominant man, had completely evaporated. I had spent half a decade watering a dead plant, hoping it would miraculously bear fruit. Now I was uprooting the entire garden and salting the earth. Setting an absolute boundary is not a negotiation. It is a declaration of self-worth. I had given Trey every conceivable opportunity to be a genuine partner. I had provided the resources, the emotional support, and the unwavering loyalty required to build a lasting dynasty together. Instead, he chose to play a petty game of dominance in a backyard barbecue. He wanted to force me to kneel in front of his family to prove he was the master of his domain. He failed to realize that true masters do not need to demand submission from their partners. True masters control the access to the kingdom. My phone buzzed in the cup holder. It was a confirmation text from Marcus, my lead attorney. The asset freeze order had been successfully filed and stamped by the duty judge. Trey's personal bank accounts, which relied entirely on automatic transfers from my business, were now effectively frozen, pending the marital separation audit. He could not move a single dollar. He could not secure a hotel room for the night. He could not even pay for a rental car without his card bouncing. He was stranded on an island of his own making. I reached forward and pressed the ignition button. The engine roared to life, vibrating through the steering wheel, and up my arms, a mechanical reflection of my own renewed energy. I put the car in drive and guided it toward the exit ramp of the parking garage. The heavy metal security gate rolled upward, revealing the vibrant orange and purple hues of the Atlanta sunset. I had roughly 2 hours until the deadline I gave Vance. 2 hours before Trey, Jada, and his entitled family would leave that barbecue and drive back to the mansion, expecting to find me crying and packing my bags in the master bedroom. I pulled out onto the busy city street, joining the steady flow of evening traffic. I decided to head to a quiet, upscale lounge located a few miles away from my neighborhood. I needed a comfortable vantage point. Vance had already synced the security camera feeds from the mansion directly to my phone. I would be able to watch the entire operation unfold in real time from the comfort of a private velvet booth with a glass of expensive bourbon in my hand. The transition from accommodating wife to formidable adversary was finally complete. I was no longer emotionally invested in his reaction or his mother's inevitable outrage. I was operating purely on logistics, risk management, and consequence delivery. When you remove a malignant tumor, you do not mourn the loss of the diseased tissue. You celebrate the survival of the host. Trey and his family had acted like parasites, feeding off my success while simultaneously trying to break my spirit. Tonight they were being surgically excised from my life. I glanced at the digital clock on the dashboard. The countdown was ticking. Vance and his team were already on site. The smart locks were being wiped clean. The designer bags and expensive shoes were being tossed into cardboard boxes. The stage was being meticulously set for the greatest reality check Trey had ever experienced. He wanted to play the role of the undisputed alpha male. He was about to find out exactly how quickly an alpha becomes a stray when the real boss changes the locks. The velvet booth at the back of the upscale lounge offered the perfect vantage point. The ambient lighting was kept intentionally low, and the slow jazz music playing softly from the overhead speakers created an atmosphere of absolute tranquility. It was the exact opposite of the chaotic, hostile environment I had just abandoned. I placed my smartphone on the polished mahogany table and leaned back against the plush seating. The high-definition screen was divided into a grid, displaying the live security feeds from every angle of my property. The resolution was sharp enough to capture the rustling leaves on the giant oak trees lining the driveway. I ordered a glass of aged bourbon neat and waited for the show to begin. It was exactly 7:45 when the headlights of Malik's oversized SUV pierced the growing dusk, sweeping across the manicured front lawn of my estate. Right behind his vehicle, Vivian's pristine Cadillac rolled smoothly onto the property. They had not stayed to enjoy the rest of their holiday cookout or wait for the fireworks. The desperate need to establish dominance and put me in my proper place had completely overridden their desire to celebrate the holiday. They had formed a unified caravan of self-righteousness traveling across the city with the singular purpose of staging a family intervention. They intended to corner me in my own home, surround me with their collective disapproval, and bully me into submitting to Jada. I watched intently as the vehicle doors opened on the surveillance feed. Trey stepped out first, adjusting the collar of his expensive polo shirt. He walked with that exaggerated rolling swagger he always adopted whenever he felt backed by a supportive audience. Jada climbed out of the passenger seat, trailing closely behind him. She was still clutching her supposedly ruined Dior bag, holding it against her chest like a shield of absolute victimhood. Vivian, Malik, and Harper followed, forming a tight phalanx of unwarranted entitlement. Harper was already waving her hands in animated conversation, probably drafting the exact psychological buzzwords she planned to hurl at me to ensure I felt sufficiently unhinged. They were treating my private residence like a courtroom, and they had enthusiastically appointed themselves the jury and the executioners. I took a slow, deliberate sip of my bourbon, letting the sharp burn anchor me to the present moment. Through the high-definition